It's been a massive year in American politics and a dramatic campaign for the White House. Assassination attempts, court cases.
This was a rigged trial.
And a change in presidential nominee.
So I've decided to pass the torch to a new generation.
So I'm here in Washington, D.C. to ask our correspondents, what's it like to cover the US presidential election? So team, from thousands of kilometres away, this has felt like a chaotic, a fascinating, frankly an exhausting campaign. But I'm watching from a very long way away and you guys have the front row seats. What's it been like close up?
I think the word we always reach for, perhaps too often, is extraordinary, but it really has been. It's been unprecedented, it's been tumultuous. Every time we thought the game had changed, it changed again.
It's because we grow up with this diet of American culture. When you come here and you're up close, it does feel like you're almost in a movie. This is history in the making.
I mean, Jade, you've covered Australian politics. You've now covered an American election campaign, which, yeah, as you say, often feels like entertainment, a TV show, rather than a policy debate. How does an Australian campaign compare to one here?
There is a level of engagement here that is very different to Australia. I mean, the thing that is so important here, of course, is that we don't have compulsory voting in the United States. So much of what the major parties are trying to do is to rally their supporters, to get people to go out and volunteer, to get people to vote. And so I think there's just a different energy to a lot of these events, and they are made for TV, and we do have the celebrity influence, and there's a lot of money poured into American campaigns.
Just the conventions, right? They're these massive events on a scale I cannot comprehend in Australia. Tens of thousands of people in stadiums cheering on politicians. Like what on earth? You've all been to them. We've watched them on TV, but you've all been to one now.
I think so. I went to the Republican National Convention, which was 2 days, I think, after the attempt on Trump's life in Butler, Pennsylvania. And the energy in that room when you walk into the stadium is incredible. Now, that was obviously an incredible moment in time.
It's a cliche, isn't it? It's the Super Bowl of politics, but it actually really is.
And the sporting analogy is, again, probably overused, but also it is accurate. And you have these two teams that have their own colours, they have their own symbols, and like the donkey and the elephant, and the people who are very wedded to their political identity. In America, people will identify themselves as Democrats or as Republicans or independents in a way that you just wouldn't see in Australia. Both sides try to claim that this is a movement that they're leading. It's not just about this election.
I think the contrast between the two conventions was, yes, in both of those arenas, incredibly high energy. After the first assassination attempt on Donald Trump, there was, he received this hero's welcome. There was this sense that he was almost sort of being treated like a martyr. There were delegates on the floor who had patches on their ears in solidarity with the wound that he had. And people there really felt at that time like momentum was on their side, that he was this leader on their side of politics who was projecting this incredible image of strength in their view at a time when Joe Biden was in a world of pain, and they really felt like the election was theirs to lose. Fast forward to the Democratic convention, I think so much excitement around Kamala Harris, but also this sense of relief, and you saw that in the way that the scheduling, which is always very political in itself, played out. Joe Biden was giving us a speaking slot on night one. Thank you very much, Joe. And then he went off on holiday, and it was all about Kamala Harris. And the delegates in those stands, you could feel it coming from them, where they were really, really relieved that Joe Biden had stepped aside, that all of those concerns they'd had about his candidacy, they could now set aside and get behind this new candidate.
A little behind the scenes thing is that those delegates are kind of captive there. Like they actually, they have to be there for the whole evening's program. It would be frowned upon were you to leave. So there is also this sense there that they're kind of like kids on a school trip or something. Like
you've got to be kept in line and yeah.
There is an overwhelming sense of optimism that they can win this race. I was surprised. I didn't go to the Republican National Convention. The Democratic Convention, I was shocked by how well they were able to pack that schedule, because I did think, okay, surely after you've done the Obamas on day 2, day 3 is going to feel a bit of a dud. But instead, they bring in Oprah.
Kamala Harris!
They managed to keep this momentum going. And actually the Democratic Convention, there was a point where we literally couldn't get onto the floor because there were just too many people trying to pack into this arena. Now, I don't know if that was a testament to the level of excitement or the fact that they had all these celebrities.
Or the Beyonce rumours that turned out to be unfounded.
Exactly.
America's ready for a better story.
It feels like several times this year we've had a situation where the sort of political cards have been dealt and one side has had one advantage or vice versa, and then the table has just been flipped. And I feel like the table has been flipped several times this year, even going right back to the beginning, right? This extraordinary start to a presidential campaign where you've got one candidate under indictment, charged with 90-something offences, criminal offences. You've got another candidate, the incumbent, who it turns out would, later step down in this very extraordinary sort of primary election that wasn't really. It was sort of a non-event.
Yeah, I think by the time, the election year began, we'd already had this period of so much focus on Donald Trump's criminal charges, the 4 cases, seeing the former president, pop up in various courtrooms in various different states.
This was a disgrace.
There had been a sense, if we went back to the midterms in 2022, that perhaps Donald Trump's influence was waning. This predicted red wave in Congress didn't materialise. A lot of the candidates he'd backed failed to perform. And so there were these open questions and this real chatter about candidates like Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, people really being talked up as these drama-free kind of Trump alternatives.
Also, Ron DeSantis, there was so much hype and excitement ahead of him possibly announcing. And by the time he made that decision, Trump was off and running because, the indictments changed it. It clicked for him. But, despite all this drama, the fascinating thing about this country is because of the way of the electoral system works, the polls don't change much.
And it just shows you how small shifts in a community like this one could determine who wins the White House.
That's right, yeah.
Incredible, hugely exciting moments. They've got the public excited in this election in a way that they weren't at the beginning of 2023, but the movement on the polls is so small because it comes down to those swing states and tens of thousands of voters possibly within those states.
I think it's that, but I think it's also the Trump factor. Even though now we have Trump versus Kamala Harris, for a long time it was Trump versus Joe Biden. So you have this extraordinary situation of 2 men who have a 4-year record in the White House competing, and a population who basically knows them completely.
Who these men are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's not many people who Donald Trump is going to convince to vote for him if they haven't previously, and seemingly the opposite is also true. People who voted for him are probably going to vote for him again. And yes, there was this excitement when Kamala Harris took over, but actually, again, the polls aren't that different to what it was like under Joe Biden. And so it has been a strange campaign in that regard.
But I don't think it was clear that those indictments would play out the way they played out. So from the beginning, the narrative was Trump will delay. That's what he does. And the fact that he has been able to do that with each of those cases is incredible, to have watched that play out through the legal process.
And Barb, you've been covering these court cases in New York quite a bit. You've been back and forth from DC to New York all year, right? And even they've become a political circus.
By the end, you were seeing prominent MAGA Republicans turning up to support Donald Trump. We saw Robert De Niro outside the court. It became a sort of campaigning stage for Donald Trump, and he and the party used it apparently very effectively. And again, the polls didn't really change through his indictment.
Count 33 and 34 guilty.
Well, he's going to the election as a convicted felon, but unpunished, which is, I think, a confusing thing for the population to kind of understand. I was there in the day Trump took the stand. Now, that wasn't in the criminal matter, that was in the civil case. There was no jury. There was no need to act up to the jury. It was a judge who was going to determine the future of his business empire, and Donald Trump used it as a platform to run his political line. And the longer I've been here and reading his first book, The Art of the Deal, you realize that this is Donald Trump's modus operandi. He always fights, no matter what slight it might be. He can't help himself, but that's also why he is so popular with his base. They love the idea of a fighter for them in the White House.
I think it's always important to remember that there are a lot of people voting for Donald Trump who are not his base. I mean, we were doing some just voxies in Georgia, and this couple appeared to be total Trump fans, or that's how I took it, because all the answers were that they were voting for him and they didn't like Kamala Harris. We turned off the camera and they told us they can't stand him. There's still a lot of Republicans holding their nose, as they say, and voting for Donald Trump.
And if you look at policy, if you look at what the policy debate has been through this year, there's a lot of political theatre and bluster and circus. But as I've been travelling around the country talking to voters and talking to people, it's been cost of living, abortion and reproductive rights, immigration, and sort of the state of democracy are the consistent four things that just come up over and over and over again. And that policy debate has not changed all year. It hasn't changed with the change of candidate on the Democratic side. It still seems to be what voters care about. Is all the rest just political theatre? Does it mean anything?
I mean, you do, if you look at those issues that you've just mentioned and you sort of look at the two that are considered strengths for Republicans and strengths for Donald Trump, he has such a powerful message on some of those issues. You know, it's a well-worn line, were you better off 4 years ago? Or name two things that have been done that have improved your life during this term. But that resonates with people, and people are thinking back to his time in the White House pre-COVID and feeling like, you know what, I did have more money in my pocket. My household finances did seem better, and that is incredibly motivating factor when it comes to people casting their vote. Similarly, on immigration, this was always going to be a huge issue given Donald Trump's focus on that in his first term, also given that we've seen, you know, this historic spike in the number of people crossing the border between the US and Mexico under Joe Biden. But Republicans have this line that, you know, every state is now a border state. And I've spent time on the border in communities that are absolutely affected by this issue, and no matter which side of politics they're on, that is a big issue for them. But then you go to a state like Iowa for the caucuses, and that's one of the biggest issues for Republican voters there as well, which is nowhere near the border.
Yeah.
I think also the Democrats for a long time thought the border issue wasn't something they needed to address, and pretty late on in the cycle realized this is a big issue for voters. And yeah, they're walking a difficult line saying, oh, well, we tried to pass this bill, but the Republicans, you know, led by Donald Trump, vetoed that. But you know, that was well into their term in office.
And didn't want to call it a crisis for 3 years,
right,
and then
yeah.
suddenly changed the language at the start of this year.
And then the other thing I think the Republicans changed was this message about democracy and the threat to democracy. And you know, I came here in early 21, and the amnesia about January 6th was and is incredible. And I just don't think that message was resonating about the threat to democracy. It might with the party faithful, but with the voting public, that's not something that's...
And it didn't seem like it was resonating in the way that Joe Biden as candidate was prosecuting it. And you've noticed this very different delivery strategy of what is fundamentally the same message, but hitting on very different points, using very different language, and maybe that's...
Tim Walz came in as the VP, like he partly got there because he used the word weird.
These guys are creepy and yes, just weird as hell. That's what you see. That's what you see.
Which they then backed away from, but it was so effective because it was a little bit funny, it was on the attack, and it just seemed to hit home. Then this weighty message about democracy, which voters who are concerned about immigration issues, about cost of living, just couldn't really understand what that meant.
And the power of the slogan is, again, fascinating watching it up close, right? So Kamala Harris, for a long time, was running this, when we fight, we win, which always felt a bit clunky to me.
Because when we fight, we win. Thank you.
And then it seemed almost accidentally that they came with, we're not going back. which became this chant at rallies that people seem to really embrace. And that was one of the moments where I thought, there's something here. Like that seemed almost organic. I don't know, maybe it was decided in a back room somewhere.
From watching the first moment that it took off, it did seem like the crowd developed it, and then Kamala Harris herself went, oh, actually, let's lean into this.
We are not going back. We are not going back. Not going back. We're not going back.
I think it means whatever you want it to mean. We're not going back. Does it mean we're not going back to another Donald Trump presidency? Does it mean we're not going back to restrictions on reproductive rights? Does it mean we're not going back in terms of, you know, what Kamala Harris would represent, even though she really shies away from sort of tackling this head on and not making this about her gender or her race? It would be, in so many ways, historic to have a female woman of colour in the White House. So I think her base certainly takes from that whatever their own interpretation is, and you know, it has really become a rallying cry.
Donald Trump's, it does feel like he's running basically the same campaign he's run 2 times before, right? It's still Make America Great Again, and obviously that has become this kind of iconic imagery and slogan, but are people at this point saying we're ready for something new? Does it feel a bit tired on the third go? We will see.
I mean, one of the words, as I've been going around the country, that I hear the most often is the word fight. From the very top level, when we fight, we win, from Kamala Harris, all the way down to individual voters. We are fighting Democrats. We need to fight and beat those Republicans. It's a very aggressive word. While at the same time, we're hearing a lot of voters say, we need more civility, we need to get along more, we need to come back together. Those two concepts don't seem to go together.
To go back to the RNC, when the narrative was put around by people in Trump world that he was a changed man and he was going to talk about unity, but all the talk about unity at the RNC was uniting the Republican Party to beat the Democratic Party. And the same, whoever gets in obviously is a president for all Americans, but yes, it's hard to see also how there's talk of healing divisions, but there's no obvious action from either side that would suggest that that's what you're doing.
And it's a great political tradition, right? A leader is elected, they come to office, their first speech, I'm going to govern for all, I'm going to bring this country together, we've just had a vigorous debate, but now we're a united country. It's getting harder to believe that these days.
Well, when you've got both sides sort of framing this election, you know, any election is about the future of a country. In the United States, obviously, that also has a big influence on the world. But when you've got both sides framing this election as, you know, almost the other side posing an existential threat to the future of the United States, then that is a reflection of how polarised the country is, that there would be so many voters who not just could, you know, get on and live with whatever side wins. They feel like that will fundamentally change their lives, change the course of this country, and that is just something they cannot allow to happen.
And we all use the language polarised, and again, it's one of those terms that you can't help but reach for because it does describe the situation. The thing I'm still slightly torn on is whether or not this is that different than it has been in America for a long time, right? People keep saying this is the most consequential election in our lifetime, but they said that 4 years ago, and they said it 4 years before that, and I'm sure, you know, pick your moment in history, right? But I think it does feel like Donald Trump doesn't play by the rules that other previous leaders had played for in many ways. And he does talk about major overhauls to the way the system operates in a way that I think other political leaders didn't. That's why he is so popular with his base. They love the fact that he came from outside politics, that he had all this ambition of draining the swamp, as he said, and now has this ambition of, you know, firing huge amounts of bureaucrats or at least moving them away from DC. Yes, it's difficult because on one hand, the Democrats are describing Trump as this existential threat to democracy. Donald Trump's framing Kamala Harris as a Marxist who wants to turn America into a communist state.
Do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do.
Comrade Kamala Harris and the communist left to do.
This terminology does percolate up from the population, right? People do see this and take it on board, and that does create a more volatile environment.
One of the confusing things from outside is sometimes Donald Trump's popularity, I think, for many Australians. That is a question. And so a lot of voters actually don't think that much changes. So that's why they're able to vote for him, because a lot of people, as you've heard, say, well, I felt a bit better off. So Despite them constantly saying this is so consequential, a lot of voters don't see differences in their daily life, although the abortion issue they do, and that's why that has been such a successful issue up until now, at least. We'll see how it plays out for the Democrats, because that's a real and tangible impact on people's lives.
This decision doesn't mark the end of the matter for either side. And I was outside the Supreme Court when Roe fell, and it was just this extraordinary, there's that word again, but it was this scene of, I think someone shouted out or word went round on phones what the outcome was, and people burst into tears on both sides. People who had spent years and years and years fighting to have Roe v. Wade overturned, and people who thought my rights have just been stripped away. It was such an emotional scene, but was political from the outset and has only become more so as really one of the biggest focuses of the Democrats' campaigns.
So we're just a few days away from Election Day, from at least the campaign being over. It's been really interesting to me watching how the campaign plays out differently in different places. I went to Alabama. I don't think I saw a single commercial around the election. I barely saw a lawn sign. I went to Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and it was every second ad during the local news was for a political candidate. You three have, I think between you, been to every swing state now pretty well. What must it be like to live in one of those parts of the country?
I mean, I think it's probably exhausting. I think if you're not politically engaged, it's probably slightly irritating because you are bombarded with advertisements. Like when I was at the DNC, which was held in Illinois, Chicago, Illinois, which is a very safe Democratic state, and then crossed into Wisconsin. And as soon as you cross that border, suddenly you very quickly recognize that your attention is being sought by both sides. It's just wall-to-wall ads.
We were in Philadelphia, which is this kind of blue bubble within a swing state, and on the radio, even driving around, Kamala Harris ad after Kamala Harris ad, and then on our drive out of Philly down that main highway, 3 Trump billboards in a row. You know, you cannot escape it when you're living in those sorts of states. I think people recognise the power that they have, but it must get exhausting as the weeks drag on.
America is amazing politically because there is so much money in this system and so many people are working in it, right? There's going to be billions of dollars spent on this election, and there are so many tens of thousands, if hundreds of thousands of people who work on it, including, as you would love, Casey, data mining every single potential district and who can vote. But in 2016, Hillary Clinton did not go to Wisconsin at all during the primary contest. That is, during the general election. She'd been there during the primaries, but she did not go because they didn't realize they were at threat. They didn't consider Wisconsin to be a weak point for them. And so I think there is still this concern, particularly on the Democratic side, that maybe they're not sure exactly how this map plays out. So yes, the money is focused on these 7 swing states, but I think they're not making the same mistake they made previously in ignoring other states that potentially could play a role.
I think also there's cynicism. I mean, we talked to a guy in Georgia who's like, he was a black man, you know, these politicians turn up and they come to the black churches and they tell you it's the most important election ever, and then you never see them again. And so I think there is a level of, maybe not bitterness, but yes, recognizing that this attention that they get is short-lived.
It's theatrical.
Yes, and of course from the media as well.
So it's been a very long year for you. It's been a very long year for this country. Does this election end on November 5th?
I mean, absolutely not. I think we may get a result quickly. We may, but even if we get a result quickly, you would think there will be disagreements about the way the voting system played out. The Republicans have already made clear that they have questions about who's on the voter rolls in different states. Similar themes that we saw at the last election will play out again. But also, again, we have not just the presidential and vice president being president and vice president being determined, but you also have the Senate, a third of the Senate's up for re-election, and you've got the entire Congress. And who holds those 2 chambers will also be hugely influential in how this country is run.
But I think the other thing to remember is, unlike in Australia, Election Day sure is in November, inauguration isn't until January, so you do have this period where it's not like whoever wins moves straight into the White House.
So it's been this roller coaster of a political year. You've had front row seats for the entire year through all of the ups and the downs and the drama. I wonder what all of you are taking away from watching this political year and what you've learned about America.
I would say I've come to an even greater appreciation of the magic of America. There is an alchemy about this country. There's an energy about this space. Yes, there are some fundamental problems with the way the politics runs here. And obviously we've seen terrible examples of political violence this year, but there is something about America when you're here and you experience it, which has been a privilege to be up close to. And I would also say that this election is going to be hugely consequential. If Kamala Harris wins, then Donald Trump is almost certainly going to be tried in 3 criminal matters. He's managed to delay them up until now, but almost certainly he will face a judge on those cases. And that could mean the extraordinary situation of a former American president going to jail, and then raises the questions of whether or not we see pardons. If Donald Trump wins, then he has promised to completely upend the American political system. This election does matter, and so people need to be paying attention to it.
Despite it appearing that they've got this very binary choice, a lot of people, they take it really seriously. Again, get away from the rallies, which are exciting in their own way, and talk to people. This is something they think about deeply. And for example, when Biden had that disastrous debate, talking to some Democrats here in DC, it impacted them, just ordinary voters. They were shocked, they were unsettled, and then, as Jade said earlier, the sense of relief.
So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation.
It matters to them, and so I think it can be easy to be cynical about America from a distance, and I guess the exciting thing about being here is being able to dig a little beneath the surface of that and see that there's a lot more.
And I'm always really grateful that Americans, all over the country welcome us into their lives, invite us into their homes, introduce us to their friends. Sometimes they're quite puzzled by why would an Australian, news outlet be so interested in my views and in my life. And we explain to them that, there is such high interest from Australia in what happens here. It gets back to that earlier point that, for all of the drama and the sort of the blockbuster that this campaign has become, what happens in America matters to the rest of the world. It matters to an ally like Australia, but it's, got much broader consequences than that. So I think some of the highlights of this year for me have been sitting around kitchen tables or sort of meeting people in these very, everyday situations, and contrasting that with these huge moments has been a real privilege.
Well, the year is nearly over. You can nearly have a sleep, but a little bit more of a push to go, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the campaign and Election Day and whatever comes after that.
Thanks, Casey.
Thanks, Casey.